Welcome to another one of our summer sermon series introduction videos. Wow, that's a mouthful. We're so grateful for Pastor Brad and Kyler as they've been preparing these videos for us. Pastor Brad won't be featured quite as much in this video as he's away at camp, but Kyler is here and he's going to be doing a great job presenting this week's material for us. So grab a Bible or a device with a Bible on it as we prepare for another good question.
Let's dive into the context provided by the verses directly before our good question, starting in John 5, verse 1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, although this is suspected by some to be Passover, the truth is, we don't actually know what feast this was because John doesn't specify. But we do know that there are three feasts that the Jews were obligated to go to, as decreed in Deuteronomy 16, verse 16, which says this: 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, at the feast of unleavened bread, at the feast of weeks, and at the feast of booths.
In Zechariah 8, the Lord says, "And I will return to Zion and dwell in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem will be called the faithful city, and the mountain of the Lord Almighty will be called the holy mountain."
The Feast of Unleavened Bread was a 7-day feast that served as an accompaniment to the Passover, and it started on the day after, or on the 15th day of the first month, which would have been about late March or early April. The two are often lumped together despite having different instructions, but the Jews were required to go to Jerusalem for both. The Feast of Weeks, or in Hebrew, Shavuot, was also known as Pentecost because it came 7 weeks and 1 day, or 50 days after the Passover. Now, this shouldn't be confused with Pentecost Sunday, which comes 50 days after Easter. The Feast of Booths, or in Hebrew, Sukkot, was also known as the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, for more information on all of these feasts, I would encourage you to dive into Deuteronomy 16 or Numbers 28 and 29. The fact is that regardless of which feast this was, it was not as important as the fact that these events in John 5 take place on the Sabbath, which we learn later in the chapter in John 5 verse 9. John chapter 5 verse 2. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. The 5-roofed colonnade would have looked something like this, and the archaeological evidence for this structure and for the pool of Bethesda is actually one of the most concrete pieces of evidence that we have to prove the legitimacy of John's Gospel. The site was excavated in the late 19th century, and it took over 100 years for it to be properly interpreted. We now know that the pool was separated into 2 different sections, and there was a structure in the middle which made up the 5th roof colonnade, giving us this unique looking structure, just as John described in his Gospel. John 5 verse 3 says, "In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed." Now, after this verse is where things get a little confusing, and in fact they get a little controversial. If you pay close attention, you might notice that in modern versions of the Bible, verse 4 is not actually included in the main text, but is added in as a footnote instead. And it says this, picking up halfway through verse 3. "Waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred in the water. Whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was healed of whatever disease he had." Now, the reason this is added as a footnote and not in the main text is that some of our earliest and most reliable manuscripts don't actually include this verse. And there's lots of different opinions on where this verse came from and how we should handle it. The truth is that we don't actually have a definitive answer for that, but we wanted to share with you some of the opinions that are out there. Theory number 1. This theory suggests that this verse 4, should be taken literally, and that God was actually healing people in the pool through the aid of the angels. Theory number 2 is that this is just what was commonly believed of the pool at the time, and that it was a common enough belief involving the pool that John didn't feel the need to include it in his gospel, but was a note added by a later scholar to clarify what people were believing at the time, and eventually it just got copied into the text. Theory number 3 is that this is actually a pagan worship ritual put in by the Romans to honor their god of healing, Asclepius. We know that there were many such shrines built by the Romans all around this area during their time of rule over Jerusalem. But the fact is that all these theories have naysayers, and we don't actually know for certain what the purpose of the pool of Bethesda was, or where John 5 verse 4 originated. But one thing we do know for certain is that a paralytic man was healed at the pool by Jesus and Jesus alone. John 5 verses 5 and 6. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" Or in the NIV, "Do you want to get well?" So, what about you? Do you want to get well? And more than that, are you willing to do what it takes and accept the change that might impact your life when you do get well? We encourage you to be thinking about these things and be praying over this passage and these questions as we come into Sunday morning.